NATO is trying to do whatever they can to get Ukraine to be part of NATO. Nope, that's not what we're trying to do. No, that's exactly what they're trying to do, and this is why they promised us they would never do this, and now they're going to be doing this. Nope, that's not what they're doing. So, he's pushing, and then all of a sudden, the article comes up from The Guardian. If you want to show that article real quick, I think it's The Guardian. You know which one I'm talking about. NATO accelerating the membership. Yup. NATO allies back fast-track membership for Ukraine, says clever U.S. Foreign Secretary. Says Ukraine has evolved quickly as Zelensky tells summit it can be an engine of green growth. So, all of this time that they're talking about this is now leading to, we have to use this as an opportunity to bring them into NATO. Then Putin is going to come out and say, well, I told you guys this was the entire intention, this is why I'm doing XYZ because I knew you guys were doing this. Is he that calculating of a guy that he's forcing his opponent and his enemy to expose their hand, or is it just accidental that this happened because he didn't think the war was going to last this long? You know what I'm asking? Yeah, I do. And I think the man's highly intelligent, and there is no doubt in my mind that he views what you just said as a welcome development, that his opponent is essentially revealing his hand, saying this is what we're really all about. But I do think at the beginning he still thought there was a degree of goodwill in the West that he could exploit. And there is none. That's what he's found out. Unpack that. I think because of his experience watching various administrations. Remember, he met with Bush, he subsequently met with Obama, and ultimately with Trump. Each time he was trying to understand us, trying to understand what we were about. And I think he listened to what was said in private, and he convinced himself that these people really aren't the enemy. You know that they are unreasonably obsessed with or fascinated with NATO, which he doesn't see any reason for. I mean, quite frankly, since he had, one of the things that's very funny is people say, well, he was going to invade Eastern Europe. Well, wait a minute, you told me back in March that his army was small and incapable, and now you're telling me he was always going to invade. I mean, which is it? It's a bunch of nonsense. So, he wasn't going to invade, he wanted to do business with everybody badly because he knows that if Russia is to continue to develop and grow, he needs technology. Most of the tech that he wants is in Germany. So, Germany is enormously important to Russia and always has been. Well, now he's turning away because he's trying to substitute Chinese, Indian, and other economic powers for German cooperation. But the bottom line is that I think Putin miscalculated up front. There was no goodwill he thought there was. And now he knows it. So what are you going to do about it, Mr. Putin? And I think the Russians are all standing around saying, okay, we like you. You've done a great job. The army is ready. It's up and running. It's now large enough and strong enough to do what needs to be done. Mr. Putin, what are you going to do? Yeah, and makes sense. We're going to see how much of that was, wasn't expecting it. He was just kind of going in to do it, and then now all of a sudden the hands are being shown. But let's look at the other side. The other side is, anytime it happens in sports, it happens in families, it happens in companies. Oh, look what's going on in Amazon. 6 of Jeff Bezos' C-suite executives all resign on the same day. Hey, look at Elon Musk today with Twitter. 1,250 employees resigned. That place is a civil war today, right? And they'll say things like this, and us as readers, we're not in it. We're like, oh wow. Shit's hitting the fan in Twitter. Shit's hitting the fan in this place. If you look at it, we're with the Wagner Group, okay? Wagner Group, or, whatever they want to call themselves. These guys come out and he's a billionaire himself. He's done well for himself, and hey, our goal is to do this and our goal is to do that. And then a story comes out saying Putin disappears after Wagner coup chaos, Daily Mail. Russian President Vladimir Putin has not been seen publicly since he addressed the nation regarding the Wagner Group failed amidst rumors of Putin's flight to Tver region. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, wonderful guy by the way, noted cracks emerging in the Russian administration. Putin, in a pre-recorded message, termed the Wagner troops' move as a stab in the back of our troops around the people of Russia. What we are facing now is a treason. Okay. And then obviously talks about who Yevgeny is and what he's done, all this stuff, which I'd love for you to talk about that as well. When that happens from the outset, it's very easy for the enemy to say, look what's going on over there. Even his people don't support his decision. He's about to be replaced. It's about to be very quickly like the last time this happened. We saw this 25 years ago when this took place. Within somebody came in and took over Russia. That's exactly what's going to be happening, right? Opposing message of how you said this thing's going to be done in Ukraine. Very quickly the other side said he's about to fall in the next week. Watch, this thing's going to happen very quickly. That's not a good look when that happens, where the leader of a country has to leave because they're worried about what's going to happen to him. So, 1 from the optic standpoint, 2 from he's got an 89% approval rating. If he does, why are people going against him? And there are clips of people supporting Yevgeny saying, hey, thank you for doing this. Optics matter. Well, the people that were thanking Yevgeny Prigozhin were not thanking him for rising up in some sort of uprising. It never was, and Prigozhin made that very clear. We'll learn more in the future. But what we know at this point is the following. First of all, Putin didn't flee anywhere. Putin wasn't afraid of anything. He has 30,000 troops. He did take 10,000 in the Ministry of Interior Forces. These are very, very heavily armed police, and moved them into various areas because they had intelligence already on many Ukrainian terrorist cells. They simply went out there and eliminated all of these. That was simply a case of let's go do it, get it over with, in the event that there's something going on between them and this group in the Wagner Group. It turns out that Putin did talk directly to Prigozhin. That came out today. Assuming that's true, he claimed that he was talking to Lukashenko, who's the president of Russia. Now, if that's in fact true and Putin talked to him, then the whole thing ended very quickly, and the argument for ending it according to Prigozhin was, we don't want to shed any Russian blood. So, then the question is, why did you do it? And one of the key reasons, I think that there are 2 possibilities. One is, I think Prigozhin was speaking for a lot of people who are very dissatisfied with it because they feel strongly that this Ukrainian war should be brought to a close. Let's stop it. The only way to stop it is to advance to attack and crush the enemy. And their view is that there's so little left now on the Ukrainian side. Why are we waiting? Let's get this done. The longer we wait, the greater the ability that NATO and its friends will find an excuse to intervene, and we don't want that to happen. Putin's taking the position while I'm holding back just in case NATO intervenes. In other words, I've got hundreds of thousands of troops. I've got a huge strategic reserve. If they're dumb enough to intervene, then I've got that, on hand that I can employ. That's a debate that is unfolding. We're hearing about a shakeup in the Russian high command. You'll recall that Putin had a meeting with some journalists. A small group of them, and he talked to them for 3 hours, something you never hear anybody in the United States do, any politician that is, and he was very straightforward and frank. We had the transcripts, and one of the things that came up was a discussion about the senior leadership. And one of the journalists said, we're concerned because we're getting feedback from a lot of soldiers that we can do better, that we need more aggressive, more capable leaders. And he said, I think there's something to that. And I've got to look into it. I've got to look at it. I think we're going to see a shakeup in the high command. Now there's an unsubstantiated rumor out there that the commander-in-chief of Russian airborne forces is now taking over the theater. I don't know. Haven't seen it confirmed anywhere. That could be the case. Also in the same report, Gerasimov is returning to his essential duties as chief of the general staff. He's no longer going to run anything in connection with the war in Ukraine. Shoigu seems to be Shoigu. He's Putin's friend. I don't think Putin holds him because he's a civilian. He's not a professional soldier directly responsible for anything that's not right. So I think we'll see some shakeup in the high command, and that may foreshadow some offensive action. Now, here's another theory that this was a carefully constructed show for the West, to convince everybody that Russia was falling apart and see who said what and so forth. I don't buy that. I don't either. I buy the first argument. Yeah. And people say, well, my gosh, how could this happen? George Marshall relieved 32 corps and division commanders during less than 3 years of fighting during World War II. Large numbers of senior officers were removed and changed and moved around and given new commands. This is not unusual in war. It happens. If it doesn't happen, you're in a lot of trouble. I mean, one of the complaints that I've had about the U.S. military and the Army in particular is no change. Why no? Well, it's a stagnant pool of people and talent. You need fresh blood, fresh eyes, and I'm sure that Putin has discovered that's required in the Russian military. And I think we'll see it beyond that. I can't speculate anymore because I don't know, and I haven't talked to anybody who does. You know, the whole thing about, if we keep going the way we're going, this NATO thing's going to get done with Ukraine, and they're going to become a member. We gotta kind of slow our roll the way we're going. Look, whether they go hard or go soft. What do you think are the chances that Ukraine's eventually going to be part of NATO? Non-existent. Non-existent. Yes. That's not going to happen. No. And this is the problem. We don't seem to understand that if we continue to insist that whatever remains of Ukraine become part of NATO, we're going to see hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on the Polish border. They're just going to roll right across Ukraine. It will not stop until they hit the Polish border and the Romanian border. That's very clear. That's not what he wants, and in the end I keep trying to explain this to people. If you know anything about Western Ukraine, I grew up with people from Western Ukraine. They do not want anything to do with the Russians, and Putin knows that. He doesn't want to run the place. He doesn't want to govern it. He just doesn't want it to be a platform for attack against Russia, which is what we tried to turn it into. I also think the majority of Ukrainians that are still there, and maybe even the majority of their way, they may not like Russians, but I don't think they support this war. And the reason I say that is that if you go back to the election that brought Zelensky to power when he was picked up from nowhere as a comedian and sponsored by Kolomoisky, who's a very powerful oligarch in Ukraine, he ran on a peace platform. He said, if I'm elected, I'll make peace with Russia. Well, virtually everybody, something like 89%, went out and voted for it. They wanted peace with Russia. There were only a few people in the far west of Ukraine that didn't support that. So, I don't think Zelensky is by any stretch of the imagination as widely supported as people think. And you talk about their situation right now. He has press gangs. Press gangs are groups of people that go out and forcibly drag Ukrainians into the Ukrainian military because they need manpower. He's now doing that in the far western portions of Ukraine, where he said he wouldn't do it in Galicia and in the Carpathian, what used to be called the Carpathian Military District. Ukrainians are leaving. Ukrainians are moving out. There are reports now that Ukrainians are actually stoning and in some cases shooting at these press gangs from the Ukrainian army in western Ukraine. That they don't want to go to war. They don't want to fight. We're getting reports that platoon and company-sized elements down in southern Ukraine are defecting. They're simply saying, look, we've had it. We can't do this anymore, and they're coming across and surrendering. And very, very smartly, the Russians from the beginning have treated all of the Ukrainian prisoners very, very well. They have not harmed them. They have not abused them or brutalized them. They facilitated prisoner exchanges, whereas we've got videotape of Ukrainian soldiers kneecapping with the AK-47s Russian knees of soldiers that are in captivity. We have video of them executing because the Ukrainian soldiers that did actually posted it on YouTube on the internet. So he's run a very good campaign in the sense that he's made it very clear we don't want to kill you. We're not really that we want this to end too, and it has had an effect inside Ukraine that we are not hearing about these things and not reported to us in the Western media because it undermines the narrative. Did you see the Wall Street Journal story about a few days ago of Wagner mutiny revives U.S. fears over control of Russia's nuclear weapons? The Wagner parliamentary paramilitary group failed insurrection in Russia led by Yevgeny has reignited concerns over control of Russia's nuclear arsenal, as U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken put it. Anytime you have a major country like Russia that has signs of instability, that's something of concern. Despite these tensions, U.S. officials stated that they detected no irregular activities or changes in alert levels related to Russia's nuclear forces. Is that a real threat, or is that just a story to over-exaggerate what's really going on to put fear in the American people? Absolutely. Second one, yes, absolutely. You're not hearing anything truthful from this administration, and the media is conspiring with the administration to misinform the public. It's simple truth. The same thing's happening in Western Europe. Nobody is being told the truth. The only way to get the truth is to talk to people who are over there on the ground. Fortunately, I have some people who are willing to do that and pass me information, and we forget that there are people in Poland that have grandparents who are Ukrainians living in eastern Ukraine. We forget that there are people who are Slovakian, some are Czech, who actually have brothers-in-law or cousins working in banks in Moscow. In other words, they're over there, they're telling the truth. Yep. I just don't think we're getting it, and I don't see any evidence that that's going to change anytime soon, and that worries me because if we continue to push this false narrative and we make it abundantly clear that there will be no negotiation, which is what we're effectively saying. Right now, Putin has the following choice. You can pull all your forces out of Ukraine, you can prepare to commit suicide in public and remove yourself from office, and then we'll talk. I mean, that's absurd. There's no chance of any of that happening. So, where are we headed? I think we're headed to lots of Russian troops on the Polish border unless someone wakes up in Europe. And I think it could happen in Germany and it could happen in France, where those governments are very fragile right now. I think Schultz's approval rating is about 32 or 33%. If they get rid of him and you get a new coalition involving the Alternative for Germany and maybe even the left on the far left, those two groups are all opposed to this war, and there is no support in the German population for going to war with Russia. If you ask anybody in Germany, are you prepared to suit up and go to the Eastern Front? Everybody says, are you out of your mind? Of course not. If that were to happen, then Putin would have someone he could talk to in Berlin, and Berlin then could conceivably lead us out of this dead-end road. But that hasn't happened yet, and again, I think that's something else that Putin is watching for. I think that's another reason why he's held back. Had Russia and Germany grown close over energy deals and pipelines? Wasn't there a story narrative that, thanks to the Russians turning off the pipeline as part of the Ukraine conflict, these poor Germans are going to be freezing in the winter? So, aren't they, in recent times, fairly dependent on Russia, probably in a position where it might not be a bad idea to be the moderating voice? In 1914, Russia and Germany were each other's principal trading partners. When the war broke out, they were already each other's principal trading partners. So, Colonel, worst case, best case scenario here. Okay. Best case, obviously, we know what the best case is. Okay. They figured out it's done, there's a way to coexist, and everything goes smoothly. How bad is the worst case? This question's been asked. Many people have gone to different places, given different elements of the worst case. Here's the thing that concerns me most of all that could lead to the worst case, which I regard as a nuclear exchange, all right? No one in Russia, Putin, no one in Beijing, neither government has an interest in launching a nuclear weapon. I mean, they understand that if you use a nuclear weapon, the rapidity with which war will escalate is mind-numbing. That's the great myth of the so-called tactical nuclear weapon that you hear from the U.S. Air Force and others, and the Navy. Oh well, we can shoot a nuke, a low yield, only 5 kilotons, only maybe 30 or 40,000 people. No one will notice. In other words, this is a useful battlefield weapon. Outrageous nonsense. It is not. If any nuclear weapon is used, everybody escalates, and the reason for that is simple. Everyone's afraid that if they don't use their arsenal, they'll lose it. So, we don't want to get there. How do we get there if we're stupid? If we're stupid and we try to engage the Russians conventionally, we'll lose. It is one thing the Russians can handle, it's conventional warfare. You've already seen that in Ukraine. They can defeat us conventionally. We don't have enough forces to send. We don't have enough troops on active duty. If we try to suddenly mobilize and send someone across the Atlantic, we're going to encounter a huge Russian submarine fleet, which will sink everything that tries to cross the Atlantic. We will have no support out of anyone in Northeast Asia. The Koreans, the Japanese, nobody wants to be part of this war. So, if you think you're going to have a backdoor into Russia across the Pacific, you've lost your mind. So if we engage them in conventional terms, we will lose, and we don't want to do that. In other words, let's not push that envelope. But that means that you have to recognize two things. First of all, in Europe, these borders have changed dozens of times over 1,000 years. Everybody looks at this border that constitutes the current Ukrainian construct and says, oh well, that can never change. It's absurd. It never made any sense when Lenin created it because the Ukrainians live primarily west and a little bit to the east, to the very northern edge of White Russia, that's it. And this thing called Ukraine, Ukraina, which means on the edge or the margin or something, had been ruled by the Duchy of Lithuania, then the Kingdom of Poland, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for hundreds of years. And its ownership passed back and forth with Russia because the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fell apart on its own. My point is that we are imputing a degree of legitimacy to these borders that was never there, and that was Putin's speech that he gave months ago, long before the war, saying, look, these borders don't make any sense because you got all these Russians in East. Brzezinski, when he was alive, pointed to that and said that's dangerous. We need to sit down and talk with the Russians and fix this problem because otherwise, the presence of all of these Russians in eastern Ukraine is going to end up being a catalyst for war. Now we thought we could get the Ukrainians to maintain a multinational, multicultural state where these people would be accepted and could live as co-equals. This is the Minsk Accords that you said. Later, people said no, we were lying. Yeah. But the truth is in Europe, how well have multinational, multilingual, multicultural states worked? Well, not so good. You know the Soviet Union fell apart instantly, and what do you have now? Multiple nations. Czechoslovakia fell apart instantly because Czechs and Slovaks didn't want to live together. This is the history of Europe. And historically, great powers have come to terms with each other and said, look, let's come up with this compromise. It may not be perfect. We may have to revisit this in 20 years. But let's get peace. In other words, let's establish peace first. Then we can come back and revisit it in the future as necessary to ensure everybody's interests are met. We won't do that. We have built ourselves up into this foolish notion that we're the indispensable superpower. We must dominate everything. Nothing on this planet can happen without us. Wrong. This planet went on for thousands of years before we showed up. You know, we can go anywhere you want with the Armenians, with the Turks, talk about Azerbaijan. I was talking to somebody, and I said, you realize these are Azerbaijani Turks, and this was a member of Congress said, what's that? I mean, Americans don't know anything that happens beyond their borders. Frankly, we don't study it, and the people that are governing us aren't paying attention to it right now. You try to explain Ukraine, and they don't understand what that is, what it really means, it's history. If they understood any of it, we wouldn't be involved in it. We're not competent to sort this out, the European this out.